Some graves just won't stay put. I'm Director Chen, and I've been managing Willowbrook Cemetery for 12 years now. In all that time, I've learned that paperwork tells stories, sometimes stories you don't want to hear. But Plot 47B has been telling me the same story for 3 decades, and each time I read it, the details change just enough to make my skin crawl. It started when I was reviewing our burial records for a city audit. Standard procedure, cross-reference plot numbers with death certificates, burial permits, the whole 9 yards. Most plots have maybe 2 or 3 entries over 50 years. Plot 47B had 17, all for the same grave, all dated between 1993 and now. The first entry was straightforward enough. Margaret Holloway, aged 74, buried March 15, 1993. Natural causes. Her daughter signed the paperwork, paid for a simple pine casket and basic service. Nothing unusual there. But the second entry, dated just 6 months later, showed the same plot being excavated for family relocation, signed by someone named Margaret Hollywood. I figured it was a clerical error. Hollywood, Holloway, easy mistake. But then I found the third entry, Margaret Holloway, buried again in Plot 47B, 2 years after the supposed relocation. Same daughter's signature, but the handwriting was different, rounder, more careful. Over the next week, I pulled every single document related to that plot. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about record keeping. 17 burials, 17 exhumations. The name changed slightly each time. Margaret Holloway, Margaret Holloway, Margaret Holloway, Margaret Holloway. Always Margaret, always starting with HOL. But never quite the same. The handwriting changed too. Sometimes angular and rushed, sometimes careful and precise, sometimes slanted to the left, sometimes perfectly vertical. But according to the signatures, they were all signed by the same woman, Margaret's daughter, Linda. I called the number on file for Linda. Disconnected. I tried the address, a small house about 10 miles from the cemetery. The current owner, a young man with paint-stained fingers, said he'd bought the place 5 years ago from the bank. Foreclosure. No forwarding address for the previous owner. That's when I decided to visit Plot 47B myself. It sits in the older section of the cemetery, where the headstones are simpler and the grass grows a little wilder. The marker is granite, weathered but readable. Margaret Holloway, beloved mother, 1919 to 1993. Standard inscription. Nothing unusual. But the ground around it looked. The soil was darker than the surrounding area, richer somehow. When I knelt down and pressed my hand against the earth, it felt soft, almost fluffy, like potting soil. Every other grave in that section had the hard-packed clay typical of our region, but Plot 47B felt like it had been freshly turned. I called our groundskeeper, Martinez, over to take a look. He's been here longer than anyone, started working the grounds when he was 16. If anyone would know about unusual burial activity, it would be him. Oh, that one, he said when I showed him the plot. We've dug that one up more times than I can count, always for the same family. Nice lady, comes by maybe twice a year with the paperwork. Says her mother wants to be moved closer to family, then changes her mind and wants her back here. Do you remember what she looks like? Martinez squinted, thinking. Hard to say. Kind of ordinary, brown hair, maybe gray, medium height. She's got one of those faces that's hard to pin down, you know, but she's always very polite, always has all the right forms. That night, I stayed late in the office, going through those 17 files again. I laid them out chronologically and studied each signature, each form, each permit. The more I stared, the more unsettled I became. The handwriting wasn't just different, it was evolving. The earliest signatures were shaky, uncertain. The middle ones grew more confident. The recent ones were almost artistic in their precision. But it was the death certificates that made my hands shake. Each one listed a slightly different cause of death. The first, natural causes. The second, heart failure. The third, respiratory complications. By the 10th iteration, Margaret had apparently died of everything from stroke to kidney failure to something called systemic deterioration. I pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the dates more carefully. The death date never changed, March 10th, 1993. But the burial dates were all over the place. Some were months after the death date. Others were weeks before. Before the death date, I must have stared at those impossible dates for an hour before I noticed something else. In the margin of the most recent burial permit, there was a small notation in pencil. Plot prepared in advance as requested. It was initialed by someone with the letters M.H. Margaret Holloway. The next morning, I arrived at the cemetery early and went straight to plot 47B. The headstone was exactly as I remembered it, but something was different about the inscription. The death year read 1994, not 1993. I went back to my office and pulled the file again. Every single document now showed 1994 as the death date. Every burial permit, every death certificate, every exhumation order. Even my handwritten notes from the day before showed 1994. But I remembered 1993. I was sure of it. That afternoon, our phone rang. The caller ID showed M. Holloway. "Hello," said a voice I'd never heard but somehow recognized. "I need to make arrangements for my mother's burial. Plot 47B, please. She passed yesterday." I looked at my calendar. March 11th. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, my voice barely steady. "What was your mother's full name?" "Margaret Holloway," the woman said, with one L this time. The line went dead. I've kept those 17 files locked in my desk drawer ever since. Sometimes I take them out. Security cameras don't lie, but they don't always tell the truth either. I'm Rosa, and I've been working the night shift at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 8 years. I prefer the quiet hours when the phones don't ring and families aren't dropping by with questions about flower arrangements or casket handles. It's just me, the deceased, and the steady hum of the refrigeration units. At least, that's how it used to be. The funeral home installed new security cameras last spring, 12 high-definition units covering every angle of the property. The owner, Mr. Garrett, said it was for insurance purposes after we had some vandalism in the parking lot. Motion sensors, night vision, the works. Each camera feeds into a central monitoring system in my prep room, so I can keep an eye on things while I work. I was grateful for the company at first. The little screens flickered with familiar views. The front entrance, the chapel, the viewing rooms, the parking lot. During slow nights, I'd glance up from my work and watch the empty spaces, finding comfort in their stillness. The first time I saw her was on a Tuesday in late May. I was embalming Mrs. Patterson, a sweet woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep, when movement on monitor 3 caught my eye. The camera covers the east section of the cemetery, where the older graves cluster beneath the oak trees. A figure in a dark coat was placing flowers on one of the headstones. Nothing unusual about that. People visit at all hours, especially when they're grieving. But something about her posture struck me as odd. Too straight, too formal. She stood perfectly still after placing the flowers, like she was waiting for something. I finished with Mrs. Patterson and checked the timestamp. 2:43 a.m. Late for a visit, but grief doesn't follow normal schedules. When I looked back at the monitor, the woman was gone. She appeared again 3 nights later, this time on monitor 7, the west section of the cemetery. Same dark coat, same flowers, same rigid posture. I made a mental note to mention it to the groundskeeper in the morning. We like to keep track of regular visitors, especially ones who come at unusual hours. But when I checked the footage the next day, scrolling through the night's recordings, I found something that made my coffee go cold. The timestamp showed the woman placing flowers on the west section grave at 2:43 a.m., the exact same time I'd seen her in the east section 3 nights earlier. I rewound the footage from Tuesday night. There she was at 2:43 a.m. east section, placing white lilies on a headstone. I fast-forwarded to Friday night. 2:43 a.m. West section. Same flowers. Same posture. Same woman. Two different locations. Same exact time. I started paying closer attention after that. She appeared every few nights. Always at 2:43 a.m. Always in a different section of the cemetery. Monitor 2. North section. Monitor 9. South section. Monitor 11. The mausoleum area. Always the same ritual: approach the grave, place white lilies, stand in perfect stillness for exactly 3 minutes, then disappear. The pattern bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I started keeping a log, noting which graves she visited and cross-referencing them with our records. The deceased were all different ages, different causes of death, different burial dates. The only thing they had in common was that none of them had received visitors in years. Their files were marked with red stickers, our code for graves, with no living family members. Then I made a discovery that kept me awake for the rest of the week. While reviewing the footage one morning, I decided to check all 12 monitors simultaneously for that Tuesday night. I opened each feed in a separate window on my computer screen and synced them to 2:43 a.m. She was on every single camera, not just the cemetery cameras, but the interior ones too. Monitor 1 showed her in the front lobby, placing flowers on the reception desk. Monitor 4 showed her in Chapel A, arranging lilies on the altar. Monitor 6 caught her in the viewing room, setting flowers beside our display caskets. 12 different locations. Same woman. Same exact timestamp. I called in sick the next night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. How does someone appear in 12 places simultaneously? Was it a glitch in the system? Some kind of digital artifact? When I returned to work, I decided to watch the monitors more carefully during the 2:40 time frame. At 2:42 a.m., I positioned myself directly in front of all 12 screens. The feeds showed empty rooms and deserted cemetery sections, exactly as expected. At 2:43 a.m., she appeared on Monitor 3, East Section Cemetery, placing white lilies on a weathered headstone. I immediately switched my attention to the other monitors. Empty, all of them. But when I switched back to Monitor 3, she was gone. The flowers remained, bright white against the dark grass. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the saved footage from that exact moment. According to the recordings, she had appeared on all 12 cameras simultaneously, just like before. The timestamps were identical down to the second, but I'd watched it happen live, and I'd only seen her on one monitor. The cameras were recording something my eyes couldn't see in real time. I started experimenting. Each night, I'd position myself to watch specific monitors during her appearance. The results were always the same. I could only see her on one camera at a time, but the recording showed her on all of them. It was as if my perception was limited to experiencing her presence in a single location, while she existed everywhere at once. The graves she visited began to show changes. The headstones looked cleaner, as if someone had been carefully washing them. The grass around them grew greener, more lush. Fresh flowers appeared on some of them during the day: roses, carnations, baby's breath. Not lilies. Never lilies during daylight hours. I tried talking to the day shift staff about the mystery visitor, but they just shrugged it off. Probably someone who works odd hours, suggested Janet, our receptionist. Some people can only visit at night because of their schedule, but I knew it was more than that. I'd started recognizing the graves she visited, memorizing their locations during my breaks. Plot 17, in the East Section, Thomas Brennan, died 1978, no surviving family. Plot 94 in the West Section, Eleanor March, died 2002, estranged from her children. The mausoleum crypt marked simply Baby Johnson, born and died the same day in 1956. Forgotten graves, abandoned graves, graves where love had run out years ago. Last Tuesday, I decided to meet her. I waited until 2:42 a.m., then walked outside to the East Section. The night was clear and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through my jacket. I positioned myself near Thomas Brennan's headstone and waited. At 2:43 a.m. exactly, the air around me grew still. The wind stopped. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath forming white clouds. And then I felt her presence, not saw, but felt. A weight in the air, a sense of someone standing just outside my peripheral vision. I turned slowly, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of her. An elderly woman in a long dark coat, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was kind, but infinitely sad, with eyes that seemed to hold decades of grief. She was holding white lilies, just like in the footage. She looked directly at me and smiled a gentle, knowing expression that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Then she knelt beside Thomas Brennan's grave, placed the flowers against the headstone, and whispered something too soft for me to hear. When she stood up, she was gone. But the lilies remained, and carved into the base of the headstone were words that hadn't been there before. Someone remembers. I checked the security footage the next morning. All 12 cameras had captured the same scene. I'd witnessed the woman placing flowers on Thomas Brennan's grave. But in the recordings, I wasn't there at all. Just an empty cemetery at 2:43 a.m., with a mysterious woman tending to a forgotten grave. She still comes every few nights. I don't try to interact with her anymore. Some kindnesses are too sacred to interrupt, even when you can't quite understand them. Some things stay warm long after they should have grown cold. I'm Mills. Been maintaining the grounds at Rosewood Mausoleum for 15 years. It's peaceful work most days. Trimming hedges, cleaning marble, replacing wilted flowers. The dead don't complain, and their families appreciate the care we put into keeping the place dignified. But Vault 12 has been testing my understanding of what's normal and what isn't. The mausoleum houses 64 crypts, arranged in 8 rows of 8, built into the hillside like ancient catacombs. Each vault is sealed with a heavy marble slab, engraved with the deceased's name and dates. Most of them stay pleasantly cool year-round, thanks to the natural insulation of being partially underground, except for Vault 12. It started during my routine maintenance last winter. I was checking the integrity of the seals, we do this quarterly, to ensure no moisture gets in, when I noticed the marble slab covering Vault 12 felt warm against my palm. Not just room temperature warm, but genuinely warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight. That struck me as odd, since the mausoleum stays consistently cool, even in summer. I made a note to check the heating system, thinking maybe there was a pipe running behind that particular wall. But when the HVAC technician came out the following week, he found nothing unusual. No pipes, no electrical issues, no explanation for the warmth. Vault 12 houses Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, interred 3 years ago after passing at age 79. According to her file, she'd been a piano teacher for most of her life. Never married, no children. Her funeral had been small, just a few former students and neighbors. The kind of quiet end that makes you appreciate the life someone lived, even if it was mostly lived alone. I started paying special attention to Vault 12 during my rounds. The warmth was consistent, noticeable, even through work gloves. In February, when we had that brutal cold snap that dropped temperatures to below zero, every other surface in the mausoleum was frigid to the touch. Vault 12 remained as warm as a summer afternoon. It was during the spring cleaning in March that I discovered something else unusual. I was polishing the marble plaques when I noticed Margaret's wedding ring. She was buried, wearing a simple gold band on her left hand. I remembered seeing it during the interment, a touching detail that suggested perhaps she'd been engaged once, or maybe it was her mother's ring. But now, the ring was on her right hand. I stared through the glass panel that allows families to view the deceased, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The casket seal was intact. No one had accessed the vault since the burial. Yet somehow, Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore's wedding ring had moved from her left hand to her right. I convinced myself I must be misremembering. 3 years had passed since the interment after all. Maybe the ring had always been on her right hand. I pulled her burial file and found the funeral director's notes. Deceased wearing gold wedding band. Left hand, third finger. The paperwork was clear. The ring had moved. That night, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I kept thinking about Margaret, alone in that warm vault, and wondering why anyone would be buried wearing a wedding ring if they'd never been married. I decided to do some research. The local historical society had records going back to the 1800s. It took me most of Saturday morning, but I finally found what I was looking for in the 1957 wedding announcements. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, age 22, engaged to James Robert Kellerman, age 24. The wedding was scheduled for October 12th, but there was no wedding announcement. Instead, I found James Kellerman's obituary, dated September 30th, 1957. Car accident on Highway 47, just 2 weeks before his wedding day. Margaret had kept his ring for 62 years. The more I learned about Margaret's life, the more the warmth of Vault 12 made sense, in a way I couldn't quite articulate. She devoted herself to teaching children piano after James died. Never dated again, never removed the engagement ring. Her former students described her as kind but melancholy, someone who carried a deep sadness behind her gentle smile. I started visiting Vault 12 during my lunch breaks, not for maintenance, but just to sit nearby and think. There was something comforting about the warmth, especially on cold days. It felt like the marble was holding onto something precious, not just heat, but something more essential. Love, maybe, or longing. Then came the day I heard the music. I was cleaning the windows in late afternoon when a soft melody drifted through the mausoleum. Piano music, delicate and melancholy, the kind of piece someone might play when they missed someone deeply. I followed the sound to its source, Vault 12. The music seemed to be coming from inside the sealed crypt. I pressed my ear against the warm marble and listened. It was definitely piano music. Chopin, I think, though I'm no expert. The melody was being played slowly, with long pauses between phrases, as if the performer's heart wasn't quite in it, or as if they were waiting for someone to turn the pages. The music stopped abruptly when I stepped back from the vault. I waited, listening for it to resume, but the mausoleum returned to its usual silence. Over the following weeks, I heard the piano music several more times, always in the late afternoon, always the same melancholy pieces, always emanating from Vault 12. I mentioned it to my supervisor, but he just chuckled and said old buildings make all kinds of settling noises. Probably pipes expanding, he suggested. Or maybe it's just the wind. But I knew what I was hearing. It was piano music, played with the skill and emotion of someone who'd spent a lifetime teaching others to find beauty in black and white keys. Last month, I decided to research the pieces I'd been hearing. I hummed the melodies for a friend who teaches music at the community college, and she identified them immediately. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Debussy's Clair de Lune, and Pachelbel's Canon in D. All wedding classics. All pieces that might have been played at a ceremony in 1957. The pieces that Margaret never got to play at her own wedding. Yesterday, I made a discovery that changed everything. While updating the burial records, I found a sealed envelope tucked into Margaret's file. Inside was a handwritten note, apparently left by Margaret herself before her death. When I go, please put James's ring on my right hand. I want to save my left hand for when we meet again. Also, if anyone ever hears piano music coming from my resting place, don't worry. I'm just practicing for the wedding we never had. MEW. The funeral director had apparently honored her first request, but never shared the note with anyone else. I went to Vault 12 immediately after reading Margaret's letter. The marble was warm as always, radiating that gentle heat that had puzzled me for months. I placed my palm against the surface and spoke quietly. Margaret, I know about James. I know about the wedding that never happened. If you're practicing in there, I think that's beautiful. The warmth beneath my hand seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat, or like someone silently saying thank you. That afternoon, for the first time in months, I heard no piano music from Vault 12. But the marble remained warm, and I understood that some love stories are too strong to end with death. They just find new ways to continue. In the space between memory and hope, between what was lost and what might still be possible. Dead pickup addresses shouldn't exist, but they keep calling anyway. I'm Kay, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Funeral Services for 6 years now. It's straightforward work. Pick up the deceased from hospitals, nursing homes, private residences, bring them to the funeral home for preparation. The families are usually grateful, the facilities are professional, and the paperwork is always in order. Until I started getting calls for 17 Oak Street. The first time it happened was on a rainy Thursday in October. Dispatch called me around 2 p.m. with a standard pickup. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, 17 Oak Street. Family requested transport. Nothing unusual about the details. Natural death, elderly woman, no complications expected. I plugged the address into my GPS and drove across town to the residential district. Oak Street was a quiet, tree-lined avenue with modest houses from the 1930s and 40s. But when I reached 17 Oak Street, I found nothing but an empty lot. Not an empty house, an empty lot. Overgrown with weeds, scattered with old foundation stones, the kind of vacant space that's been undeveloped for years. I double-checked the address, walked around the perimeter looking for house numbers, even asked a neighbor if there had been a mistake. Oh, that house has been gone for ages, the elderly man next door told me. Burned down when I was just a kid. Must have been 15 years ago, maybe more. Nothing there but weeds and memories now. I called dispatch to report the confusion, but they insisted the address was correct. Family called directly, the dispatcher said. Specifically requested Kay as the driver. Said you'd know where to find Mrs. Voss. That's when I noticed the casket. It was sitting in the center of the empty lot, partially hidden by tall grass and volunteer saplings. A simple pine casket, the kind we use for basic services, positioned as if someone had carefully placed it there and walked away. The brass nameplate read Eleanor Voss in elegant script lettering. I approached it cautiously, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate prank or mistake. But when I touched the casket, it felt solid, real, properly constructed. The wood was smooth and freshly finished. There was even a small bouquet of white roses tied to the handle with a ribbon. Inside the casket, Mrs. Eleanor Voss lay peacefully arranged as if she'd just been prepared by a professional mortician. She looked to be in her 70s, with carefully styled gray hair and a serene expression. She wore a navy blue dress with a small pearl brooch, and her hands were folded over a prayer book. Everything about the scene looked completely normal, except for the fact that it was happening in an empty lot where a house had burned down 15 years ago. I loaded Mrs. Voss into my transport van and brought her back to the funeral home. The paperwork was waiting for me. Death certificate, burial permit, family contact information. Everything in perfect order. The family had prepaid for a basic service and burial at Greenwood Cemetery. But when I tried calling the contact number to confirm delivery, the line was disconnected. The funeral proceeded without incident 3 days later. A small service with maybe a dozen mourners, all elderly folks who spoke fondly of Eleanor's kindness and her famous apple pies. The burial was quiet and dignified. If not for the strange pickup location, it would have been completely routine. 2 weeks later, dispatch called again. Same address, same name, same request for me specifically. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, 17 Oak Street. That's impossible, I told them. We buried Eleanor Voss 2 weeks ago. Different, Eleanor Voss, the dispatcher replied. The family was very specific about using Kay as the driver. I drove back to 17 Oak Street, knowing what I'd find, but hoping I was wrong. The empty lot looked exactly the same, weeds, foundation stones, and no house. But there was the casket again, positioned in the same spot, with the same brass nameplate. This Eleanor Voss was perhaps in her 80s, wearing a different dress but the same peaceful expression, the same white roses, the same ribbon, the same careful arrangement of her hands over the prayer book. I've made that trip 16 times now. Always the same address, always the same name, always the same mysterious casket waiting in an empty lot. Each Eleanor Voss is slightly different, different age, different clothing, different jewelry, but always unmistakably an Eleanor Voss. The families are always small but genuine. The services are always properly arranged and paid for in advance. I've tried researching the address, looking up property records and fire reports. 17 Oak Street was indeed destroyed in a house fire in 2008. The owner at the time was listed as Eleanor H. Voss, age 73, who died in the blaze along with her sister Eleanor M. Voss and her daughter Eleanor J. Voss. 3 generations of Eleanor Voss women, all lost in a single tragic night. The neighbor I'd spoken to had been wrong about the timeline. 15 years had felt right to him, but it had actually been 17 years. Sometimes grief makes time feel elastic. I started keeping detailed notes about each pickup. Eleanor Voss number 7 was wearing a wedding ring that had belonged to Eleanor number 3. Eleanor number 11 had a distinctive scar on her left hand that matched one I'd seen on Eleanor number 5. Small details that suggested connections, relationships, a family that somehow extended beyond what should have been possible. Last week's pickup was different. When I arrived at 17 Oak Street, there was no casket waiting, just the empty lot, as barren as always. I waited for nearly an hour, thinking maybe I was early, but nothing appeared. I called dispatch to report the absence, and they seemed confused. No pickup scheduled for today, Kay. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should take a few days off. But I was certain they'd called. I had the address written in my notebook, along with the time and the specific request from me as the driver. When I showed them my notes, they just looked concerned and suggested I might be working too many hours. That night, I drove back to Oak Street on my own time. The empty lot was dark and quiet, but as I sat in my van, watching the space where a house used to stand, I could have sworn I saw lights flickering behind the overgrown weeds. Warm yellow light, like someone had turned on a lamp in a cozy living room. I think the Eleanor Voss women are still there, in whatever remains of 17 Oak Street. They're taking care of each other, the way families do, making sure everyone gets home safely in the end. And sometimes, when one of them is ready to move on, they call a transport driver they trust to help them make that final journey. I still get calls for that address occasionally, though dispatch seems to have stopped acknowledging them officially. I always go. Someone needs to be there for the Eleanor Voss women, to treat them with dignity and respect, to make sure they're not forgotten. It's the least I can do for a family that's been waiting 17 years to finally rest in peace together. Some patterns emerge without explanation, and some mysteries solve themselves in ways you'd rather not understand. I'm Director Patel, and I've been managing Harmony Hills Cemetery for 9 years. In that time, I've learned that death brings out both the best and strangest in people. Families argue over headstone inscriptions. Mourners leave unusual mementos, and occasionally, someone decides to rearrange our carefully planned landscape according to their own mysterious logic. But Section C has been teaching me that sometimes the rearranging happens all by itself. Section C is our oldest area, established in 1923, where 74 headstones mark the graves of the community's early settlers. The stones are simple but dignified granite and marble rectangles with basic inscriptions, arranged in neat rows facing east according to traditional practice. At least, that's how they were arranged until last spring. It started on a Monday morning in April. I arrived at the cemetery for my usual grounds inspection, and found that every single headstone in Section C had been turned exactly 90 degrees clockwise. Instead of facing east toward the sunrise, they all faced north toward the old oak tree that marks the cemetery's original boundary. My first thought was vandalism. We've had problems with teenagers playing pranks, especially around Halloween. But this was different. The headstones hadn't been knocked over or damaged. They'd been carefully rotated, each one turned to precisely the same angle. The work would have required considerable effort and planning. Heavy equipment, probably, or at least several people working together. I called our maintenance supervisor, Rodriguez, and our night security guard, Jim Hassan. Rodriguez was as puzzled as I was. "Those stones weigh 300 pounds each," he said, studying the scene. "It would take a team of guys with proper equipment to move them. And why would anyone want to turn them all the same direction?" Jim's report was even stranger. "I walked through Section C at midnight, and again at 4 a.m., he insisted. Everything looked normal both times. All the headstones were facing east, just like always. We spent the morning turning the headstones back to their proper orientation. It took 4 men with crowbars and a small crane to reposition each one. By afternoon, Section C looked exactly as it should, with all 74 markers facing east in orderly rows. The next morning, they were all turned north again. This time, I reviewed Jim's security footage myself. The cameras covering Section C showed nothing unusual, just empty rows of headstones, facing east throughout the night. But in the morning, there they were, all turned 90 degrees clockwise, facing north toward the oak tree. "Maybe the cameras have a delay," suggested Rodriguez. "Or maybe someone found a blind spot we don't know about." But I'd reviewed every minute of footage. There was no moment where the headstones changed position. According to the cameras, they faced east all night. According to my eyes, they faced north all morning. We reset them again, and they turned again. We started a pattern that continued for weeks. Every evening, Rodriguez and his crew would spend hours repositioning the headstones to face east. Every morning, I'd find them facing north. The security footage never showed the transition happening. After a month of this routine, I decided to spend a night in Section C myself. I brought a folding chair and positioned myself where I could observe all 74 headstones. If something supernatural was happening, I wanted to witness it firsthand. The night was clear and quiet, with just enough moonlight to make out the shapes of the markers. I settled in around 11 p.m. after checking that all the headstones faced east. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just the usual sounds of a cemetery at night whined through the oak leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. At 3:17 a.m., I felt it before I saw it. A subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the atmospheric pressure changes. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the wind stopped completely. The silence that followed was so profound it felt heavy, pressing against my ears. Then the headstones began to move. Not all at once, and not dramatically. One by one, starting with the marker closest to the oak tree, each headstone slowly rotated clockwise. The movement was smooth and silent, as if invisible hands were carefully turning them. No grinding of stone against stone, no scraping sounds, just a quiet, deliberate repositioning. It took nearly 20 minutes for all 74 markers to complete their rotation. When the last one settled into its new northward-facing position, the normal sounds of the night returned: wind, distant traffic, the soft hooting of an owl. I sat there until dawn, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The headstones remained in their new positions, facing north toward the oak tree, just as they had every morning for the past month. But it was what I noticed in the daylight that made everything clear. From my chair, facing the same direction as the rotated headstones, I could see something I'd never observed before. The old oak tree wasn't just a landmark, it was a grave marker. Hidden among its massive roots, almost completely obscured by decades of growth, was a small stone tablet. The inscription was weathered but readable. Baby Sarah Carmichael, born and died March 15, 1923. First soul to rest in Harmony Hills. I researched the cemetery's founding records that afternoon. Harmony Hills had been established after the Carmichael family donated 10 acres of their farmland for a community cemetery. The donation was made in memory of their infant daughter Sarah, who had died on the same day the cemetery was consecrated. She was buried beneath the oak tree that had marked the boundary of their property, but somehow, over the decades, baby Sarah's grave had been forgotten. The oak had grown larger, its roots spreading over the small marker until it disappeared completely. New sections were added to the cemetery, record-keeping systems changed, and the location of the first burial was lost to time. The 74 residents of Section C had been turning to face baby Sarah's grave. They were acknowledging the cemetery's first resident, the child whose death had created their resting place. I made a decision that night. Instead of continuing to reposition the headstones each morning, I left them facing north. I also commissioned a proper headstone for baby Sarah Carmichael, positioned it beside the oak tree where visitors could see it, and added her name to our memorial registry. The morning after baby Sarah's new headstone was installed, I found that all the markers in Section C had turned back to face east. They've remained in their proper orientation ever since. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when I walk through Section C, I notice small offerings at the base of the oak tree. Fresh flowers, small toys, colorful stones arranged in careful patterns. The other residents of the cemetery, I think, making sure baby Sarah knows she's not forgotten. And on March 15th each year, the anniversary of her birth and death, I always find that the headstones in Section C have turned north again, just for that one day. An annual acknowledgement, a gentle reminder that some gestures of respect transcend the boundaries between the living and the dead. I don't reset them anymore on March 15th. Some traditions, even mysterious ones, deserve to be honored. Guest books remember things differently than the living do. I'm Blake, and I've been working as a mortician at Serenity Funeral Home for 11 years. One of the most meaningful parts of my job is maintaining our memorial guest registers, the books where friends and family sign their names and leave messages for the deceased. These records become precious keepsakes for the grieving, tangible proof that their loved one was remembered and honored. But lately, our guest registers have been telling stories that don't quite match reality. It started with Harold Pemberton's funeral last August. Harold was a retired postal worker who'd lived quietly and passed peacefully at 86. His service was small, maybe 20 people, mostly neighbors and a few distant relatives. A gentle man who'd touched lives in quiet ways. During the viewing, I kept the guest register on a table near the casket, along with a nice pen and some tissues for those who needed them. People signed throughout the afternoon. Harold's nephew from Seattle, his next-door neighbors, a few folks from the post office where he'd worked. Standard entries with kind words about Harold's character and condolences for the family. But when I collected the register at the end of the service, I found more signatures than I expected. 23 people had attended the funeral, but the book contained 31 entries. The additional signatures were in the same careful handwriting, though the names were different. Margaret Pemberton, James Pemberton, Little Sally Pemberton, and others. I assumed family members had signed on behalf of relatives who couldn't attend a common practice. But when I reviewed Harold's file, I discovered something unsettling. Margaret had been Harold's wife, deceased 12 years earlier. James was his brother, passed in 2003. Little Sally was his daughter, who died of pneumonia in 1967 at age 6. The signatures were dated the day of Harold's funeral, written in fresh ink. I mentioned the discrepancy to Harold's nephew during our follow-up call. Uncle Harold never had any children, he told me, and Margaret passed years ago. You must have mixed up the guest books with another service, but I knew I hadn't. I'd been personally responsible for Harold's register, and there had been no other services that day. The same thing happened at Elizabeth Monroe's funeral 3 weeks later. Elizabeth had been 92, a former librarian with no living relatives. Her service was attended by 7 people, former colleagues and friends from her book club. But the guest register contained 14 signatures, including entries from Robert Monroe, beloved husband, and Thomas Monroe, cherished son. According to Elizabeth's obituary, Robert had died in 1989, and Thomas had been killed in Vietnam in 1971. I started paying closer attention to the registers after that, discreetly counting attendees and comparing the numbers to the signatures. The pattern was consistent. Every funeral had more signatures than actual attendees, and the additional names were always deceased family members. The most unsettling incident happened during Margaret Chen's service in October. Margaret had been a respected teacher who'd never married and had no surviving family. Her funeral was attended by former students and colleagues, maybe 15 people total. But when I reviewed the guest register later, I found an entry that made my hands shake. "Thank you for coming, Margaret Chen." The signature was dated 3 weeks after the burial. The handwriting was identical to Margaret's signature on her pre-need funeral contract. I started researching the phenomenon, wondering if other funeral homes had experienced similar occurrences. Most of my colleagues either hadn't noticed or weren't willing to discuss it. But I found a few whispered conversations at industry conferences, morticians who'd seen extra signatures, guest books that seemed to fill themselves, messages that appeared after services ended. One veteran funeral director in Minneapolis told me about a guest register that had gained over 50 signatures in the 6 months following a burial. "All family members who'd passed before the deceased," she said quietly. "It's like they were signing in for the reunion." I decided to conduct an experiment during Robert Fitzgerald's service last month. Robert had been a widower with adult children who lived out of state. The funeral was small, but well attended by friends from his golf club and neighbors from his apartment building. Instead of leaving one guest register on the table, I used 2. One was our standard leather-bound book, positioned in the usual spot near the casket. The second was a simple notebook that I kept in my jacket pocket, bringing it out periodically to ask specific attendees to sign. At the end of the service, the notebook contained exactly 18 signatures, one for each person who had actually attended. The leather-bound register contained 29 entries, including signatures from Dorothy Fitzgerald, loving wife, and Michael Fitzgerald, devoted son. Dorothy had died 4 years earlier. Michael had been stillborn in 1972. But the most remarkable entry was at the bottom of the page, written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen in other registers. "Robert Fitzgerald, thank you for the beautiful service." I felt very loved. The signature was dated the day after the burial. I've started keeping careful records of these additional signatures, documenting the names and comparing them to obituaries and family histories. In every case, the mysterious entries come from family members who preceded the deceased in death: spouses, children, parents, siblings, people who would have been at the funeral if they'd still been alive. Last week, during quiet hours at the funeral home, I decided to test my theory more directly. I placed a fresh guest register on the table in our memorial room, along with a pen and a small sign that read, "Please sign if you'd like to pay your respects." The next morning, the register contained 7 signatures, names I didn't recognize. But when I researched them, I discovered they were all former residents of our town who had died within the past 5 years. All had been buried from other funeral homes, but somehow they'd found their way to our register. The last entry was dated that morning and simply read, "We're grateful for your kindness to our families. The departed." I've stopped trying to explain the phenomenon to colleagues or family members. They look at me like I'm losing my grip on reality, and maybe I am. But I've come to see these mysterious signatures as a gift rather than a mystery to be solved. The guest registers are serving their intended purpose. They're allowing loved ones to express their care and support for the deceased. It doesn't matter if those loved ones are among the living or the departed. Love transcends such boundaries. I still maintain careful records of actual attendees for insurance and legal purposes, but I no longer question the additional signatures that appear in our memorial books. Instead, I make sure to provide high-quality registers and reliable pens. After all, some reunions have been planned for decades. The least I can do is provide proper supplies for the guest list. Some paperwork mistakes reveal truths that were meant to stay buried. I'm Anna, and I've been the cemetery clerk at Pleasant Valley Memorial Gardens for 7 years. My job involves maintaining burial records, coordinating with funeral homes, and ensuring that every interment is properly documented. It's detail-oriented work that requires precision. One mistake in the paperwork can cause problems that last for generations. But Grave 18 taught me that sometimes the mistakes aren't mistakes at all. The discrepancy came to my attention during our annual records audit in September. I was cross-referencing burial permits with our plot maps when I discovered that Grave 18 had 2 death certificates, filed under different names, both dated October 15, 1987. The first certificate was for Maria Elena Santos, age 24, cause of death listed as complications from childbirth. The second was for Isabella Rose Santos, age 24, cause of death listed as cardiac arrest during surgery. Both certificates showed the same Social Security number, which should have been impossible. I assumed it was a clerical error. Perhaps someone had accidentally filed duplicate paperwork with slightly different information. But when I examined the burial permits more closely, I found additional complications. Both women were listed as having been buried in Grave 18 on the same date, but by different funeral homes. Maria Elena Santos had been interred by Rivera Family Funeral Services at 10 a.m. Isabella Rose Santos had been buried by Millbrook Mortuary at 2 p.m. Same grave, same day, 4 hours apart. I called both funeral homes to clarify the confusion. Rivera Family Funeral Services had been closed for 15 years, but I managed to reach the former owner, Mr. Rivera, at his retirement home. He remembered Maria Elena's case clearly. "Beautiful young woman," he said sadly. "First, pregnancy, everything seemed to be going well until the complications started. We handled the funeral arrangements for her family. They were devastated. She was buried wearing her wedding dress since she'd never had the chance to wear it. When I contacted Millbrook Mortuary, their records showed a similar story for Isabella Rose Santos. Same age, same general circumstances, buried wearing a wedding dress because she died before her planned wedding day. I decided to order an exhumation to resolve the paperwork discrepancy. If 2 women had somehow been buried in the same grave, we needed to correct our records and possibly relocate one of them to a proper resting place. The exhumation was scheduled for early October, supervised by the county coroner, and witnessed by representatives from both funeral homes. As the cemetery clerk, I was required to be present to document whatever we found. When the backhoe lifted the concrete vault from Grave 18, I expected to find 2 caskets, or perhaps evidence that someone had made a terrible mistake decades ago. Instead, we found a single casket containing only a wedding dress. Not a body wearing a wedding dress, just the dress itself, carefully arranged as if someone invisible was wearing it. The fabric was pristine white silk, with pearl buttons and delicate lace trim, sized for a petite woman. It lay against the casket's silk lining, with the arms positioned as if folded in prayer. The skirt spread out in graceful folds. The coroner examined the casket thoroughly, looking for any trace of human remains. Nothing. No bones, no jewelry, no personal effects except for the wedding dress. Even the casket's nameplate was blank, just a brass rectangle waiting for an inscription that had never been added. "This is highly irregular," the coroner said, carefully photographing the scene. "There's no indication that a body was ever placed in this casket. But the burial vault shows normal settling patterns, consistent with having been underground for 36 years. I spent the following week researching the Santos family, trying to understand what had happened in October of 1987. Property records showed that both Maria Elena and Isabella Rose had lived at the same address on Maple Street. Both had been engaged to men named David Maria Elena to David Rodriguez, Isabella Rose to David Morales. Both had planned weddings for the same date, October 22nd, 1987. The deeper I dug, the more similarities I found. Both women had worked as elementary school teachers. Both had been born in the same hospital on the same date in 1963. Both had the same parents' names listed on their birth certificates, Carmen and Eduardo Santos. I finally found the truth in the St. Catherine's Church marriage preparation records. There had been only one woman, Maria Elena Isabella Santos. She had gone by her first name with family and her middle name with friends. When she died a week before her wedding, the grief and confusion had led to duplicate paperwork being filed under both names she had used. But that still didn't explain the wedding dress in the empty casket. I contacted the church to learn more about Maria Elena Isabella's story. Father Martinez, who had been preparing her for marriage, remembered her clearly despite the passage of time. She was so excited about her wedding, he told me. She brought her dress to show me. After one of our counseling sessions, said it had been her grandmother's, altered to fit her perfectly. She wanted to be blessed in it before the ceremony. What happened to the dress after she died? I asked. That's the strange part, Father Martinez said slowly. David, her fiancé, insisted that she be buried in something else. Said the wedding dress should be saved for the wedding they'd have in heaven. But the family wanted her to wear it for the funeral. There was quite a disagreement. I found David Rodriguez's contact information and called him. He was living in Arizona now, remarried with grown children. But his voice grew quiet when I mentioned Maria Elena Isabella. I've thought about her every day for 36 years, he said. She was supposed to be my wife. When she died, I couldn't bear the thought of her wearing that beautiful dress in a coffin. It seemed like giving up on our future together. What did you do with the dress? I kept it for years, thinking maybe someday I'd understand why God took her away from me. But eventually I realized I needed to let go. I brought it to the cemetery the night before they sealed her grave. I wanted her to have it after all, even if I wasn't brave enough to put it on her myself. The pieces began to fit together. David had somehow placed the wedding dress in Maria Elena Isabella's grave, but not in her casket. Somewhere, in the confusion of grief and conflicting funeral arrangements, the dress had ended up in an empty casket in the same plot. But I had one more question for David. Do you know why there were 2 death certificates filed? He was quiet for a long moment. Maria Elena died twice, he said finally. Once in the hospital when her heart stopped during the emergency surgery. They revived her, but she died again an hour later from complications. 2 different times, 2 different causes. I guess someone filed paperwork for both incidents. We reburied the wedding dress in grave 18, this time with a proper headstone that read, Maria Elena Isabella Santos, beloved daughter, teacher, and bride-to-be. October 22, 1987 would have been the happiest day of her life. But the story didn't end there. A week after the reinterment, I received a call from David Rodriguez in Arizona. I had the strangest dream last night, he said. Maria Elena Isabella came to me wearing that white dress, looking exactly as she did 36 years ago. She said to tell you thank you for helping her get ready for the wedding. She said she's been waiting all this time, but now she understands that some promises transcend death. I filed David's call in my notes, along with all the other documentation related to Grave 18. Some stories are too complex for standard record keeping, but they still deserve to be preserved. Last month, on October 22nd, the date that would have been Maria Elena Isabella's wedding anniversary, I found fresh white roses on Grave 18. There was no florist tag, no indication of who had left them, but tucked among the flowers was a small card that read, Finally married, finally home. I added that card to the Grave 18 file. Some love stories take longer to complete than others, but they're worth the wait. Some appointments are made by forces beyond our understanding. I'm Tom, and I've been working as a funeral assistant at Heritage Memorial Services for 4 years. My job involves coordinating with families, scheduling services, and making sure every detail runs smoothly during what's often the worst day of people's lives. I pride myself on organization and attention to detail, which is why the appointment cards that keep appearing in my jacket pocket have been driving me to question my sanity. It started in November with a simple business card tucked into my left jacket pocket. Standard funeral home appointment card, the kind we use for scheduling consultations with families. It was filled out in neat handwriting. Thompson Family Consultation, November 18th, 2:30 p.m. regarding arrangements for Robert Thompson. The card wasn't in my handwriting, and I had no record of scheduling a Thompson consultation. I checked our appointment book, our computer system, even asked my colleagues if they'd taken the call. Nothing, but I decided to keep the afternoon open, just in case. At exactly 2:30 p.m. on November 18th, the Thompson family arrived. Mr. Thompson, his wife Patricia, and their adult daughter Sarah. They seemed surprised when I greeted them by name. We were driving by and felt compelled to stop in. Mrs. Thompson explained, "My husband hasn't been feeling well lately, and we thought it might be wise to make some preliminary arrangements. You know, while we're all thinking clearly." I showed them to the consultation room and pulled out Mr. Thompson's information forms. As we discussed casket options and service preferences, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had this exact conversation before, even though I'd never met the Thompson family. 2 weeks later, another appointment card appeared in my jacket pocket. Mitchell Family Consultation, December 3rd, 10:00 a.m., regarding arrangements for Helen Mitchell. Again, no record of the appointment in our system. Again, the family arrived exactly on time. Mrs. Mitchell's daughter seemed genuinely confused about why they were there. "Mom's been having some health concerns," she said, glancing at her elderly mother. "This morning she woke up insisting we needed to come here today. She said someone named Tom was expecting us." I'd never spoken to Helen Mitchell in my life, but she smiled at me like we were old friends. The pattern continued through the winter. Every few weeks, I'd find a new appointment card in my jacket pocket for a family I'd never contacted. The handwriting was always the same careful, old-fashioned script that reminded me of my grandmother's generation. The appointments were always specific: exact date, exact time, exact purpose. And the families always came. What disturbed me most was how the consultations unfolded. Each family seemed to be responding to some inner compulsion to make funeral arrangements, often for relatives who were still in relatively good health. They'd arrive confused about why they felt urgency to plan ahead, but they'd leave having made detailed prepaid arrangements. I started keeping track of the appointments in a private notebook. Thompson Family Consultation led to full arrangements for Robert Thompson. Mitchell Family Consultation led to full arrangements for Helen Mitchell. The pattern was consistent. Every mysterious appointment card resulted in a completed funeral contract. In February, I found a card that made my blood run cold. Harrison Family Consultation, February 14th, 4:00 p.m., regarding arrangements for Thomas Harrison. Thomas Harrison is my grandfather. He's 91 and in declining health, but he lives in Florida with my aunt. I hadn't spoken to my family about funeral arrangements, and they certainly hadn't scheduled any appointments with my funeral home in Oregon. But at 4 p.m. on February 14th, my cell phone rang. My aunt's number. "Tom, I know this is going to sound strange," she said, "but your grandfather woke up this morning insisting that we needed to call you about funeral arrangements. He said you were expecting to hear from us today at exactly 4 o'clock. I scheduled a phone consultation with my aunt and grandfather, walking them through the options for prepaid arrangements and discussing transportation from Florida if needed. Grandpa was surprisingly specific about his preferences, military honors, specific hymns, particular Bible verses, details I'd never heard him mention before. After the call, I researched the handwriting on the appointment cards. The script style was consistent with penmanship taught in schools during the early 1900s, the kind of careful lettering that was common among people born in the 1920s and 30s. I started paying attention to the ages and backgrounds of the families listed on the mysterious appointment cards. Almost all of them involved arrangements for elderly clients, people born during the Great Depression era who would have learned that particular style of handwriting in school. Last month, I found an appointment card that changed my understanding of the entire phenomenon. Stevens Family Consultation, March 21, 0 p.m., regarding arrangements for Margaret Stevens. Note, Margaret will be present to assist with planning. Margaret Stevens had been one of our clients from 6 months earlier, a lovely woman in her 80s who'd made detailed preparations for her own funeral before passing peacefully at home. The consultation had been thorough and touching. She'd chosen every detail of her service with care and dignity. Margaret Stevens was dead. She couldn't possibly assist with planning any consultations. But at 1 p.m. on March 20th, the Stevens family arrived. Margaret's son and daughter-in-law came in looking confused and somewhat embarrassed. "We've been having the strangest experiences since Mom passed," her son explained. "We'll be sitting in the living room, and we'll hear her voice giving us advice about things we need to take care of. Yesterday, she told us very clearly that we needed to come here today to help another family with their planning." Help another family? She said there was another Margaret who needed guidance, and we were supposed to share Mom's experience with making arrangements. She was very specific about the time and that we should ask for Tom. 20 minutes later, another family arrived, the Hoffmans, seeking consultation for Margaret Hoffman, the grandmother who had raised them after their parents died. Margaret Hoffman was 93 and in hospice care. I watched in amazement as the Stevens family shared their experience with Margaret's funeral planning, offering gentle guidance and emotional support to the Hoffmans. The consultation became a shared conversation about honoring elderly matriarchs, with practical advice flowing naturally between the families. Both Margarets, it turned out, had been elementary school teachers. Both had been widowed young and raised multiple generations of children. Both had the same careful handwriting style I'd been seeing on the appointment cards. After the families left, I found a new note tucked into my jacket pocket. Not an appointment card this time, but a simple thank you note. "Dear Tom, thank you for facilitating these important conversations. Love transcends death, and planning transcends fear. Margaret Stevens and friends." I've stopped questioning the mysterious appointment cards. Instead, I've started viewing them as a service, a way for those who have passed to continue caring for their community, helping other families navigate the difficult process of funeral planning. The appointments continue to appear, always written in that same careful script, always perfectly timed. I keep my schedule flexible now, leaving room for consultations that are arranged by forces beyond my understanding. Last week's card simply read, "Ongoing service, as needed, for families who need guidance. Thank you for your cooperation." The previous generation. I've learned that death doesn't end people's desire to help others. Sometimes the best funeral planning happens when those who've already made the journey can share their wisdom with those just beginning to think about it. My job, it turns out, is just to keep my appointment book open and trust that the right families will find their way to me at exactly the right time. Some ground refuses to be dug twice. I'm Luis, and I've been digging graves at Mountain View Cemetery for 12 years. It's honest work that requires skill, respect, and attention to detail. Every grave must be exactly 6 feet deep, perfectly rectangular, with clean walls and level bottoms. The families deserve nothing less than precision in their loved one's final resting place. But the north corner of Section D has been challenging everything I know about soil, depth, and what lies beneath our carefully maintained grounds. The north corner is the oldest part of the cemetery, established in 1908, when the original 10 acres were consecrated. The headstones there are simple affairs, worn granite rectangles with basic inscriptions marking the graves of the town's early settlers. It's peaceful ground, shaded by mature elm trees that have watched over the dead for more than a century. I first noticed the anomaly last spring, while digging a grave for Eleanor Watson, a 92-year-old former schoolteacher. Every grave requires exactly 216 shovel strikes to reach the standard 6-foot depth. I've counted the same number thousands of times over the years. It's as reliable as breathing. But Eleanor Watson's grave required only 203 strikes, 13 strikes short of the standard count. Yet when I measured the depth with our calibrated rod, it was perfect. Exactly 6 feet, 0 inches. I assumed I'd miscounted. 12 years of digging graves and muscle memory can play tricks sometimes. But as I lowered Eleanor's casket into the ground, I noticed something else unusual. The soil at the bottom of the grave felt different beneath my boots. Softer, warmer than the typical hard-packed clay we encounter at that depth. 3 weeks later, I dug Martin Kowalski's grave in the same section. 203 shovel strikes. Perfect 6-foot depth. Warm, soft soil at the bottom that felt like it had been recently turned, even though no one had dug in that area for months. I mentioned the discrepancy to my supervisor, Rodriguez, but he just shrugged. Maybe the soil in that section has different composition, he suggested. Could be old tree roots decomposed over the years, making it easier to dig. But I've been working this cemetery long enough to know every variation in our soil conditions. The north corner's behavior was completely unprecedented. Over the summer, I dug 6 more graves in the north corner of Section D. Every single one required exactly 203 shovel strikes. Every single one measured precisely 6 feet deep. Every single one had that peculiar warm, soft soil at the bottom that felt like it had been prepared in advance. I started bringing a thermometer to work, checking the soil temperature at various depths. At 3 feet down, the temperature was normal, about 55 degrees, consistent with our regional conditions. At 4 feet, still normal. At 5 feet, the temperature began to rise. At 6 feet, in the north corner graves, the soil consistently measured 72 degrees. Room temperature, as if someone had been living down there. The strangest incident happened in September, while digging a grave for Dorothy Marsh. At strike number 150, my shovel hit something solid but yielding. Not rock or tree root, but something that gave slightly under pressure. I carefully scraped away the soil to investigate. It was a wooden casket, buried about 4.5 feet down. The wood was old, but intact, with brass handles that had developed a green patina. There was no headstone or marker above ground to indicate a previous burial. I called Rodriguez immediately. Hitting an unmarked grave is a serious matter that requires careful handling and possible relocation of the new burial. That's impossible, Rodriguez said when he arrived. We've got complete records going back to 1908. There's never been a burial in that exact location. We carefully excavated around the casket, expecting to find remains that would need to be respectfully relocated. But when we opened the casket under the coroner's supervision, we found only soft, dark soil, rich, loamy earth that looked like prime gardening soil, nothing like the clay that makes up most of our cemetery. This is highly irregular, the coroner said, taking soil samples. There's no indication that human remains were ever in this casket, but the wood shows normal aging patterns, consistent with being underground for decades. We removed the empty casket and continued digging Dorothy's grave. From that point forward, it required exactly 13 more strikes to reach 6 feet, bringing the total to 203, just like all the others in that section. That night, I researched the early burial records for the north corner of Section D. The handwritten ledgers from 1908 through 1920 showed normal entries, names, dates, plot numbers. but I noticed that many of the earliest graves had been marked as relocated or moved for family reasons in the 1930s. I found the explanation in a 1934 newspaper article about cemetery improvements. The city had decided to relocate several of the original burials to make room for better drainage and new landscaping. 26 graves from the north corner had been moved to other sections of the cemetery, but the graves had been dug and prepared for the relocations. When some families changed their minds or couldn't be contacted, the empty graves were filled in, and the land was left available for future burials. Empty graves that had been waiting for nearly 90 years to fulfill their purpose. The warm, soft soil made sense now. Earth that had been dug and refilled multiple times develops a different texture and retains heat differently than undisturbed ground. The missing 13 shovel strikes represented soil that was less compacted than normal cemetery ground, but that didn't explain why every grave in that section required exactly the same reduced number of strikes, regardless of the size or weight of the person digging. Last month, I conducted a more systematic investigation. Instead of counting shovel strikes, I used a mechanical post-hole digger to excavate a test hole in the north corner. The machine cut through the first 5.5 feet of soil easily, then hit resistance at exactly the depth where my shovel count always reached 203. But there was nothing there. No obstruction, no change in soil composition, no buried objects, just an invisible barrier that required exactly 13 additional strikes to overcome. I dug similar test holes in other sections of the cemetery. Normal resistance throughout, no mysterious barriers, consistent soil conditions from top to bottom. The north corner of Section D was somehow different. The ground itself seemed to remember the graves that had been prepared but never used, maintaining space for burials that had been planned but never completed. Yesterday, I dug a grave for Robert Chen in the north corner. 203 strikes, perfect 6-foot depth, warm, soft soil at the bottom. But as I was finishing the excavation, I found something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Carved into the clay wall at the 5-foot mark, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were dozens of initials and dates. JM 1934, HW 1936, SB 1938. The markings were weathered but clear, etched by someone who had spent time at that depth. The dates corresponded exactly with the newspaper article I'd found about the cemetery relocations. These were the signatures of gravediggers from the 1930s, men who had dug graves for the planned relocations that never happened. I realized that the north corner wasn't just land that had been dug before. It was land that had been dug with purpose, prepared by men who took pride in their work, even when that work ultimately went unused. Their effort, their precision, their professional dedication had somehow remained in the soil itself. The missing 13 shovel strikes weren't about easier digging. They were about respect. The ground was acknowledging the work that had come before, requiring current gravediggers to put in exactly the same effort as those who had prepared these spaces 90 years ago. I added my own initials to the wall of Robert Chen's grave before we lowered his casket. LR 2025. A small tribute to the continuity of the work, a recognition that some jobs connect us across decades of service. When I told Rodriguez about the carved initials, he was skeptical until he climbed down into the grave to see for himself. He studied the markings for a long time before climbing back out. "My grandfather worked here in the 30s, he said quietly. His name was Miguel Rodriguez. He used to tell stories about digging graves for people who changed their minds about burial locations. We searched the carved initials until we found MR 1935. That's him, Rodriguez said, running his finger over the weathered letters. He always said a grave should be dug with the same care, whether it gets used or not, because you never know when someone might need it later. The north corner of Section D has taught me that some work transcends the immediate purpose. Those Depression-era gravediggers couldn't have known that their carefully prepared graves would eventually serve families decades later, but they dug each one as if it mattered. Now I understand why the ground feels warm and soft at 6 feet deep. It's not just soil, it's the accumulated care of generations of gravediggers who believed in doing the job right, even when no one was watching. I still count my shovel strikes out of habit, but I no longer worry about the North Corner's anomalies. Some ground has memory, and some work honors the work that came before it. The missing 13 strikes aren't a mystery. They're a gift from men who understood that dignity in death begins with dignity in preparation. Last week, a young gravedigger named Carlos joined our crew. I'm teaching him the proper techniques, the importance of precision, the meaning of respect for the dead. When he's ready, I'll show him the North Corner of Section D and let him discover for himself that some jobs connect us to something larger than ourselves. The ground remembers everything. Our job is to be worthy of that memory. Some eyes continue to watch long after the heart stops beating. I'm Joan, and I've been working as an embalmer at Riverside Funeral Home for 16 years. Part of my job involves preparing the deceased for their final viewing, ensuring they look peaceful and dignified for their family's farewell. It's delicate work that requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity. But lately, I've been noticing that some of the deceased seem to be taking an active interest in their own viewing arrangements. It started with Margaret Holloway last June. Margaret had been 83, a retired bank manager who passed peacefully in her sleep. Her embalming went smoothly, and I was able to achieve a natural, restful appearance that would comfort her family. During the afternoon viewing, I stayed nearby to make sure everything proceeded appropriately. Margaret's family was small but devoted: 2 adult children, several grandchildren, and a handful of close friends. As people approached the casket to pay their respects, I noticed something unusual. Margaret's closed eyes seemed to move slightly, as if she was tracking the movement of specific mourners. At first, I attributed it to my imagination or the lighting effects in the viewing room. The deceased don't move during viewings. It's physiologically impossible. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed a pattern. Margaret's eyes followed only certain people: her son David, when he approached the casket; her granddaughter Sarah, when she knelt to pray; her longtime friend Helen, when she placed a rose on Margaret's folded hands. But when other mourners approached: neighbors, distant relatives, casual acquaintances, Margaret's face remained perfectly still. I discreetly mentioned the observation to my colleague Frank, who's been in the business for 30 years. He looked at me like I was having a breakdown. "Joan, you've been working too many hours," he said kindly. "The deceased don't move. It's just shadows and wishful thinking." But I knew what I was seeing. During private family viewings, Margaret's eyes moved. During the public visitation, they remained still. The same phenomenon occurred at Edwin Carter's funeral 2 weeks later. Edwin had been a successful attorney who'd passed after a brief illness. During the family's private viewing, his eyes tracked the movements of his wife and children. During the public service, his face remained motionless. I started paying closer attention, making careful mental notes during viewings. The pattern was consistent eye movement, occurred only during private family time, and only when specific people approached the casket. After a month of observations, I noticed another detail. The people whose movements the deceased seemed to track were always mentioned in the will: David, who inherited Margaret's house; Sarah, who received her grandmother's jewelry collection; Helen, who was left Margaret's piano. It was as if the deceased were keeping track of the beneficiaries of their final wishes. The most dramatic incident occurred during Thomas Brennan's viewing in August. Thomas had been 91, a former factory supervisor with a complicated family history. He'd had 3 wives, numerous stepchildren, and a will that had been revised multiple times. During the private family viewing, Thomas's eyes moved almost constantly, following different people around the room with what seemed like intense interest. But the movements weren't random. They were purposeful, deliberate, as if he was studying each person's behavior. When his second wife approached the casket, Thomas's eyes tracked her movement from the door to the casket. When his stepson from his third marriage knelt beside him, the eyes followed every gesture. When his biological daughter touched his hand, the eyes moved to focus on her face. I was fascinated and disturbed by the intensity of Thomas's apparent attention. During the public visitation, his face showed no movement at all. But during family time, he seemed almost animated in his observation of the mourners. After the service, I learned that Thomas's will had contained several surprises. His second wife, who everyone assumed would inherit the house, received only a small monetary gift. His stepson, who had been expecting a substantial inheritance, was left nothing. His biological daughter, who had been estranged from him for years, inherited the majority of his estate. The people Thomas had watched most intently during the viewing were the ones who had been most affected by the contents of his will. I started researching the phenomenon, reading mortuary science journals and consulting with other embalmers. Most of my colleagues dismissed the observations as imagination or stress-induced hallucinations, but a few admitted they'd noticed similar occurrences. It's like they're making sure their final wishes are being respected, one veteran embalmer from Chicago told me during a professional conference. I've seen it maybe a dozen times over 30 years, always during private family viewings, always focused on people mentioned in the will. I decided to conduct a more systematic observation during Patricia Williams's viewing in September. Patricia had been a wealthy widow with a complex will that distributed her assets among family members, charities, and longtime employees. I positioned myself where I could observe both Patricia's face and the movements of the mourners. I also brought a small notebook to record any eye movements and correlate them with the identity of each visitor. The results were remarkable. Patricia's eyes moved to track 7 specific individuals during the private viewing: her nephew Michael, her housekeeper Rosa, her gardener Antonio, her neighbor Mrs. Chen, her late husband's business partner, her goddaughter Emma, and her attorney, Mr. Davidson. After the service, I obtained a copy of Patricia's published will. Every person whose movements Patricia had tracked was specifically mentioned in the document. Michael inherited her house. Rosa received a substantial monetary gift. Antonio was left her gardening tools and equipment. Mrs. Chen inherited Patricia's collection of books. The business partner received some stock certificates. Emma was left Patricia's jewelry. Mr. Davidson received a case of vintage wine and a thank you letter. The correlation was perfect. Patricia had observed only the people who were directly affected by her final wishes. But the most unsettling incident occurred during last month's viewing for Harold Morrison. Harold had been a retired mechanic with no close family, just a few distant cousins and longtime friends. His will was simple: everything to charity, with small gifts for the neighbors who had helped him in his final years. During the private time before the public service, Harold's eyes tracked the movements of Mrs. Peterson, who lived next door, and Mr. Garcia, who had driven Harold to medical appointments. Both had been left small monetary gifts in his will. But Harold's eyes also followed the movements of his cousin Jerry, who had not been mentioned in the will at all. In fact, Harold's attorney had specifically told me that Jerry had been deliberately excluded due to a family dispute over money. As I watched Harold's apparent attention to Jerry's approach to the casket, I noticed something different. Instead of the gentle tracking I'd observed with other deceased, Harold's eyes seemed to move with intensity, almost urgency. Jerry knelt beside the casket for several minutes, whispering something I couldn't hear. When he stood up, he discreetly slipped something into Harold's jacket pocket. After the service, I checked Harold's jacket before the final preparations. Jerry had placed a handwritten note that read, "I'm sorry for what I did with the money, Uncle Harold. I paid it back to your account yesterday. I hope you can forgive me." Harold's eyes had been tracking Jerry not because of the will, but because of unfinished business between them. The money Jerry had apparently stolen and then returned. I've come to believe that some aspect of consciousness persists briefly after death, particularly during the viewing period when families gather to say goodbye. The deceased seem to maintain awareness of their final wishes and concern for unresolved issues. I no longer report these observations to my colleagues. Instead, I've started viewing them as a final service I can provide, being a witness to the deceased's last acts of attention to their loved ones. The eyes that track movement during private viewings aren't just residual muscle contractions or tricks of light. They're the final expressions of love, concern, and attention from people who aren't quite ready to stop caring for their families. It's a privilege to witness these moments, even when they're impossible to explain. Some bonds are stronger than death, and some people continue to watch over their loved ones right up until the moment they're finally laid to rest. Some visitors don't use the same doors as the living. I'm Eddie, and I've been working the night shift as security at Westwood Cemetery for 8 years. It's quiet work most nights, patrolling the grounds, checking the gates, making sure everything stays peaceful and secure. The living rarely visit after sunset, which leaves me alone with the dead and the occasional rabbit or deer. But Gate 3 has been teaching me that alone might not be the right word for what I experienced during those long midnight hours. Gate 3 is the oldest entrance to the cemetery, installed in 1926 when the memorial park was first established. It's a wrought iron gate with an ornate lock mechanism that requires an old-fashioned skeleton key. The city has been meaning to upgrade it to match the modern electronic locks on the other gates, but somehow Gate 3 always gets overlooked during maintenance updates. Every night at exactly 11 p.m., I walk the perimeter and lock all 4 gates. Gate 1 faces Main Street and gets the most daytime traffic. Gate 2 opens onto the chapel parking area. Gate 4 is our service entrance for maintenance vehicles. Gate 3 faces the old residential district where the cemetery's founding families used to live. My routine is always the same. Check each gate, ensure it's properly secured, record the time in my patrol log. Gate 3's lock is stiff and requires some effort, but it always clicks into place with a satisfying sound that tells me it's secure for the night. But every morning when I complete my final patrol at 6 a.m., Gate 3 is standing open. Not damaged, not broken, not forced. Simply unlocked and opened about 3 feet wide, as if someone had used the proper key and closed it gently behind them. The lock is never damaged, and there are no signs of tampering or forced entry. The first few times it happened, I assumed I'd made an error. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it, or maybe the old mechanism wasn't engaging properly. I started double-checking Gate 3 during my 11 p.m. round, even taking photos with my phone to document that it was properly secured. The photos always showed the gate locked tight. The morning patrol always found it standing open. I reported the issue to my supervisor, Martinez, who suggested that we might have a vandalism problem or faulty lock mechanism. He arranged for a locksmith to examine Gate 3, but the expert found nothing wrong with either the lock or the key. Mechanism works perfectly, the locksmith reported. Actually, it's in remarkably good condition for a lock that's nearly a century old. Someone's been taking excellent care of it. That was the first strange detail. Nobody had been maintaining that lock. It was original equipment from 1926, and according to our maintenance records, it hadn't been serviced or cleaned in decades. Yet it operated smoothly and showed no signs of rust or wear. I decided to monitor Gate 3 more systematically. Instead of just checking it at 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., I started including it in my hourly patrol rounds. Every hour on the hour, I'd walk over to verify that it remained locked. The results were unsettling. Gate 3 stayed locked through midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and 4 a.m. But during my 5 a.m. patrol, I consistently found it standing open. Whatever was happening occurred between 4 and 5 a.m. every single night. I adjusted my patrol schedule to check Gate 3 every 15 minutes during that critical hour. At 4:15, 4:30, and 4:45, the gate remained securely locked. At 5 a.m., it was open. Something was unlocking and opening Gate 3 between 4:45 and 5 a.m., and I was never able to catch it happening despite walking past every 15 minutes. Last month, I decided to position myself with a direct line of sight to Gate 3 during the crucial time period. I brought a folding chair and stationed myself about 50 yards away, where I could observe the gate continuously, without interfering with whatever was occurring. At 4:53 a.m., I watched a figure approach Gate 3 from inside the cemetery grounds. The figure was elderly, wearing what appeared to be a long coat or overcoat from an earlier era. He walked slowly but purposefully toward the gate, moving with the careful gait of someone who had made this journey many times before. When he reached Gate 3, he produced a key from his coat pocket and unlocked the gate with practiced ease. He opened the gate, stepped through it, and continued walking down the residential street that runs past the cemetery. I watched until he disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. The entire scene had taken less than 3 minutes, but it answered the question of how Gate 3 was being opened. What it didn't answer was how the person had gotten a key to a lock that hadn't been duplicated in decades, or why he needed to leave the cemetery at such a specific time every morning. I reported the incident to Martinez, describing the figure and the apparent key he'd used. Martinez seemed skeptical, but agreed to review the security camera footage from Gate 3. The cameras showed me sitting in my chair, looking intently toward the gate area. They showed Gate 3 transitioning from closed to open between 4:52 and 4:55 a.m. But they didn't show any figure approaching the gate, using a key, or walking through it. According to the camera footage, the gate had simply opened by itself while I stared directly at it. "Maybe you fell asleep for a few minutes," Martinez suggested diplomatically. "Long night shifts can play tricks on your perception." But I knew I'd been awake and alert. I'd watched a man in an old-fashioned coat unlock Gate 3 and leave the cemetery. The security cameras had recorded something different, but I trusted what I'd seen with my own eyes. I decided to research the history of Gate 3 and the residential neighborhood it faces. The cemetery's original records showed that the gate had been installed as a convenience for families living on Elm Street, Oak Avenue, and Maple Drive, the houses closest to the cemetery. Many of those houses had been built by the same families who were buried in the older sections of Westwood Cemetery. The Hendersons, the Macleods, the O'Briens, and the Kowalskis had all lived within walking distance of their eventual resting places. I found the most relevant information in a 1958 newspaper article about the cemetery's expansion. The article mentioned that several longtime residents had requested that Gate 3 remain unlocked during early morning hours to accommodate their daily visits to family graves before going to work. Henry Kowalski, who has visited his wife's grave every morning for 12 years, says the early opening allows him to pay his respects before beginning his shift at the mill. The article noted, "The cemetery board has agreed to unlock Gate 3 at 5 a.m. to accommodate Mr. Kowalski and other early visitors." Henry Kowalski. I checked our burial records and found his grave in Section B, about 100 yards from Gate 3. Died in 1979 at age 86. Buried beside his wife Margaret, who had passed in 1946. The dates matched perfectly. Henry had visited Margaret's grave every morning for 33 years, from 1946 until his death in 1979. He would have been familiar with Gate 3, would have had a key when it was unlocked for early visitors, and would have walked the same route thousands of times. I visited Henry and Margaret's grave the next morning after my shift. The headstone was simple granite with both their names and dates, but what struck me was the condition of the grass around the grave. While the surrounding areas showed normal wear from weather and time, the path leading directly from Gate 3 to Henry's grave was worn smooth, as if someone still walked it regularly. Fresh flowers appeared on Margaret's grave every few days, small bouquets of wildflowers that matched the types that grow along the residential streets outside Gate 3. There was never any indication of who left them, but they were always fresh and carefully arranged. I've stopped trying to keep Gate 3 locked between 4:45 and 5 a.m. Whatever lock I use, whatever security measures I implement, Henry Kowalski apparently still has access to the key he's been using since 1946. Instead, I've started thinking of Gate 3 as serving its original purpose, providing early morning access for devoted visitors who want to pay their respects before starting their day. The fact that one of those visitors has been dead for 46 years doesn't change the sincerity of his daily routine. Last week, I left a small note tucked into Gate 3's lock. Mr. Kowalski, thank you for taking such good care of the gate and for continuing to visit Margaret. Your devotion is an inspiration. The next morning, the note was gone, but there was a small wildflower tucked into the gate's ironwork, the same type of flower that regularly appears on Margaret's grave. Some love stories don't end with death. They just change their schedule and find new ways to continue. My job is to make sure that Gate 3 remains available for visitors, whether they're among the living or the devoted departed. Some questions get more desperate each time they're asked. I'm Beth, and I've been the office manager at Greenwood Memorial Gardens for 6 years. My job involves answering phones, scheduling appointments, and helping families navigate the difficult process of arranging burials for their loved ones. Most calls are straightforward people asking about plot availability, service times, or directions to specific graves. But every Tuesday at 3:17 p.m., I receive a call that's been growing more urgent and heartbreaking each week. The first time it happened was in early September. The phone rang at exactly 3:17 p.m., and when I answered, a woman's voice asked a simple question. Can you tell me where my husband is buried? His name is William Chen, and he should be in Plot 23. I checked our cemetery records, going through the computer database, and cross-referencing with our older paper files. Plot 23 exists, located in the original section of the cemetery that was established in 1956. But according to our records, Plot 23 has been empty since the cemetery opened. I'm sorry, ma'am, I told the caller, but our records show that Plot 23 has never been used. Are you sure about the plot number? Sometimes families remember the section letter or row number differently. No, it's Plot 23, she said firmly. I buried my husband there myself. William Chen died March 10th, 1962. I remember the location exactly. I spent several minutes with her on the phone, checking various spellings of the name Chen, looking through burial records from 1962, even searching for any Williams or Bills who might have been buried around that time period. Nothing matched her description. Ma'am, I'm not finding any record of William Chen in our cemetery. Is it possible he was buried at Riverside Cemetery or Memorial Park? Those facilities were also serving the area in 1962. The woman's voice became strained. No, it was Greenwood. I'm sure of it. Plot 23. I visit his grave every year on our anniversary. She hung up without leaving her name or contact information. The following Tuesday at 3:17 p.m., the same woman called with the same question about William Chen and Plot 23. This time, I was more thorough in my search, checking every database we have access to, including the county clerk's records and the Social Security Death Index. I found a William Chen who had died on March 10th, 1962, but according to official records, he had been cremated at Miller Funeral Home with no burial listed. There was no indication that he'd ever been interred at Greenwood Memorial Gardens. When I explained this to the caller, her voice took on a note of distress. That's impossible. I remember the funeral service. I remember the burial. I remember standing beside his grave in the rain, watching them lower the casket into Plot 23. Ma'am, is there someone I could speak with who was also at the funeral? Maybe a family member or friend who could help us locate the correct burial information? There's no one left, she said quietly. Everyone else is gone now. It's just me, and I need to know where William Island She hung up again before I could ask for more details. The calls continued every Tuesday at 3:17 p.m. Same woman, same question, same increasing desperation in her voice when I told her Plot 23 was empty. By October, she was crying during the phone calls. By November, her voice was shaking with frustration and grief. "I don't understand why you can't find him," she said during one particularly difficult call. "I've been visiting his grave for 63 years. I know where he island. Why are you telling me he's not there?" I started dreading Tuesdays. The woman's distress was genuine and heartbreaking, but I had no way to help her find information that didn't exist in any of our records. I consulted with my supervisor about the recurring calls, and he suggested that the woman might be suffering from dementia or grief-related confusion. Sometimes elderly people become fixated on details that aren't quite accurate, he said. Maybe her husband was buried somewhere else, or maybe the grief has affected her memory of the events. But the woman's voice didn't sound confused or elderly. She spoke clearly and provided specific, consistent details every week. March 10th, 1962. William Chen. Plot 23. The same information, delivered with the same conviction. In December, I decided to visit Plot 23 myself. I wanted to see the physical location, to understand what the woman might be experiencing when she claimed to visit her husband's grave. Plot 23 is located in the oldest section of Greenwood, an area where many of the original headstones are simple affairs from the 1950s and 60s. The plot itself is clearly marked and easily accessible, situated between two occupied graves with weathered but readable headstones. The ground at Plot 23 was completely undisturbed. No headstone, no marker, no indication that anyone had ever been buried there. The grass grew evenly across the space, and the soil showed no signs of having been excavated and refilled. But as I stood there, I noticed something unusual. Fresh flowers were lying on the ground at Plot 23, white chrysanthemums tied with a blue ribbon, the kind of arrangement someone might leave at a grave. The flowers were recent, maybe a day or two old. Someone had been visiting Plot 23, leaving flowers for a person who, according to our records, wasn't buried there. I started checking Plot 23 during my lunch breaks, curious about who might be leaving the flowers. Every week, I found fresh arrangements, sometimes chrysanthemums, sometimes roses, occasionally mixed bouquets that looked homemade. On a Tuesday in late January, I decided to arrive at Plot 23 around 3 p.m., hoping to encounter whoever was leaving the flowers. If it was the woman who'd been calling, maybe I could speak with her in person and help resolve the mystery. At 3:10 p.m., an elderly woman approached Plot 23 carrying a small bouquet of white flowers. She was probably in her 80s, dressed in a dark coat and walking with a cane. She moved slowly but purposefully, clearly familiar with the cemetery layout. I watched from a respectful distance as she knelt beside Plot 23, placed the flowers on the ground, and began speaking quietly to the empty space as if someone was buried there. After several minutes, she stood up and began walking toward the cemetery exit. I approached her gently, introducing myself and explaining that I worked in the cemetery office. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, "but I've been trying to help someone locate information about a William Chen who might be buried in Plot 23. Are you familiar with that burial?" The woman looked at me with confusion that seemed genuine. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't know anything about a William Chen. I was just visiting my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She's buried right over there." She pointed to the grave, adjacent to Plot 23. She wasn't the woman who'd been calling me every Tuesday. When I got back to the office, the phone rang at exactly 3:17 p.m. Same woman, same question, about William Chen and Plot 23. "Ma'am, I visited Plot 23 this afternoon," I told her. "It's definitely empty, and it doesn't appear that anyone has ever been buried there." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He's not where you said he'd be. I don't understand what happened to him." That phrase haunted me for the rest of the week. He's not where you said he'd be. Not where I said, but where you said. as if she was talking to someone who had made promises about William's burial location. I decided to research more thoroughly, looking beyond our cemetery records to funeral home archives and newspaper obituaries from 1962. What I found explained everything and nothing at the same time. William Chen had died on March 10, 1962, just as the woman had said. His obituary listed his wife as Eleanor Chen. A funeral service was held at Greenwood Memorial Gardens, but instead of burial, William was scheduled for cremation, per his prearranged wishes. However, according to a small item in the newspaper 3 days later, there had been a miscommunication at the funeral home. Eleanor Chen had believed her husband was being buried in Plot 23, which had been reserved for him. But William's signed pre-need contract specified cremation, and that's what had occurred. Eleanor Chen had stood beside Plot 23, watching what she thought was her husband's burial, while his body was actually being cremated at the funeral home. She'd been visiting an empty plot for 63 years, believing her husband was buried there. But Eleanor Chen had died in 2008, according to her obituary. She couldn't be the woman calling me every Tuesday, unless grief and confusion can transcend death, just like love and devotion apparently do. Maybe Eleanor was still searching for her husband, still trying to understand what happened to the burial she witnessed in 1962. The Tuesday phone calls continued through the winter, with the woman's voice becoming more desperate each week. "He's not where you said he'd be," became her constant refrain, as if she was caught in a loop of confusion and loss. Last Tuesday, the call was different. Instead of asking about Plot 23, the woman simply said, "I found him. Thank you for your patience." The line went dead, and for the first time in months, 3:17 p.m. on Tuesday came and went without a phone call. When I checked Plot 23 the following day, I found it exactly as before, empty ground with no headstone or marker. But someone had left a small card among the usual flowers. It read, "Eleanor and William Chen, reunited at last. I don't expect any more Tuesday phone calls about Plot 23. Some searches end when people stop looking in the wrong place and start looking in the right place, wherever that might be for two people who loved each other across decades and apparently beyond death itself." Some expressions develop after the embalming is complete. I'm Max, and I've been working as a preparation technician at Eternal Rest Funeral Home for 9 years. My job involves the technical aspects of preparing the deceased for viewing, embalming, cosmetic restoration, dressing, and positioning. It's precise work that requires both scientific knowledge and artistic skill. The goal is always the same: help families remember their loved ones as they lived, peaceful and dignified, in death. But Room 7 has been challenging my understanding of what happens to the human face after the embalming process is complete. Eternal Rest has 4 preparation rooms, each equipped with the necessary tools and systems for proper embalming procedures. Rooms 1 through 3 are modern facilities with updated ventilation, lighting, and equipment. Room 7 is our oldest preparation space, installed when the funeral home was built in 1943, but it's been maintained and upgraded over the decades. I've worked in all 4 rooms, without any unusual incidents or complications. The embalming process is consistent regardless of which room I use, and the results are predictable based on the condition of the deceased and the techniques applied, except when I work in Room 7. It started last spring with Mrs. Dorothy Sullivan, a 78-year-old retired librarian who had passed peacefully after a brief illness. Her embalming went normally: good arterial distribution, appropriate color restoration, no complications with the procedures. When I finished, Mrs. Sullivan looked serene and natural, exactly as her family would want to remember her. But when I returned to Room 7 3 hours later to dress Mrs. Sullivan for her viewing, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Her face had developed a slight smile, not the neutral, peaceful expression I'd achieved during embalming, but a gentle, subtle smile that changed her entire countenance. I examined Mrs. Sullivan's face carefully, wondering if I'd somehow missed adjusting her facial muscles during the preparation process. But I'd been thorough in positioning her jaw and lips. The smile that was now visible hadn't been there when I'd completed the embalming. I consulted with my supervisor, Frank Martinez, who has 30 years of experience in mortuary science. He examined Mrs. Sullivan and agreed that her expression had changed, but he attributed it to natural settling of facial tissues after embalming. Sometimes the muscles relax in unexpected ways, he explained, especially if the deceased was someone who smiled frequently in life. The face might naturally return to a familiar expression. That explanation made sense, and Mrs. Sullivan's viewing proceeded without any concerns from the family. In fact, her daughter commented on how peaceful and happy her mother looked, which provided comfort during their grief. But the same thing happened with the next person I prepared in room 7. Mr. Harold Pemberton, an 86-year-old retired postal worker, developed the same subtle smile several hours after I completed his embalming. Harold had been a serious, reserved man according to his family, not someone who smiled easily in life. Yet there he was, wearing the same gentle expression that Mrs. Sullivan had developed. Over the summer, I prepared 6 more people in room 7. Every single one developed that characteristic smile within a few hours of embalming completion. Young and old, men and women, regardless of their personality or cause of death, they all ended up with the same peaceful, knowing expression. I started documenting the phenomenon, taking before and after photographs to track the changes. The transformation was subtle but consistent. Immediately after embalming, the deceased would have the neutral, restful expression I had created. Several hours later, that expression would shift to a slight smile that seemed almost alive in its warmth and serenity. The most unsettling aspect was that the smile appeared to be genuine, not the artificial expression that can result from improper muscle positioning, but a natural, authentic smile that suggested contentment or even happiness. I tested my theory by preparing people in different rooms. Bodies embalmed in rooms 1, 2, and 3 maintained exactly the expression I created during the preparation process. Only those prepared in room 7 developed the mysterious smile. Frank suggested that room 7 might have environmental factors affecting the embalming process, humidity, temperature, or air circulation issues that could cause unusual tissue settling. We had the room thoroughly inspected by HVAC specialists and environmental consultants. Everything checked out as normal. The mystery deepened when I realized that the smile only appeared when I was working alone. During busy periods when other staff members were present in room 7, the deceased maintained their original expressions. The transformation only occurred during quiet hours when I was the only person in the preparation area. I decided to conduct a more systematic observation. After completing an embalming in room 7 for Mrs. Elizabeth Monroe, a 92-year-old former teacher, I positioned myself where I could observe her face continuously for several hours. At first, nothing happened. Mrs. Monroe lay peacefully with the neutral expression I had created, her hands folded properly over her chest. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional sound of traffic outside. Then, at approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes after I'd completed the embalming, I watched Mrs. Monroe's face change. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual, almost organic shift. Her lips moved slightly upward, the corners of her mouth lifted, and the muscles around her eyes relaxed into what could only be described as a smile. But what made the experience truly unsettling was that the change seemed intentional, not the random movement of settling tissues, but a deliberate adjustment to her expression, as if Mrs. Monroe was choosing to smile. I remained perfectly still, watching her face for any additional changes. The smile remained constant, gentle, peaceful, and unmistakably genuine. After several minutes, I spoke quietly. "Mrs. Monroe, can you hear me?" Her expression didn't change, but I could have sworn the smile deepened slightly. I started researching the history of Room 7, wondering if there might be something about the space itself that was influencing these unusual occurrences. The funeral home's records showed that Room 7 had been the original preparation room when Eternal Rest opened in 1943. Thousands of people had been prepared for burial in that space over 8 decades. The most relevant information came from a 1967 newspaper article about the funeral home's expansion. The article mentioned that the original owner, Thomas Whitmore, had insisted that Room 7 remain unchanged, despite modernization of the other facilities. Mr. Whitmore believes that Room 7 has developed a spiritual atmosphere over the years. The article noted, he says that families consistently comment on how peaceful and happy their loved ones appear when prepared in that room. The same phenomenon I was experiencing had been observed for over 50 years. I found additional references in the funeral home's historical records. Family testimonials from the 1970s and 80s repeatedly mentioned how content and serene their relatives appeared after being prepared at eternal rest. Several families specifically noted that their loved ones looked happier in death than they had been in their final illness. The pattern suggested that Room 7 had been creating that characteristic smile for decades, bringing comfort to grieving families who interpreted the expression as evidence that their relatives were at peace. But I still didn't understand why the smile only appeared when I was alone in the room, or why it seemed to develop intentionally rather than randomly. Last month, I had an experience that provided some insight. While preparing Mr. Robert Chen, a 73-year-old retired teacher, I mentioned aloud that his family was looking forward to seeing him the following day. "They're going to miss you, Mr. Chen," I said as I worked. "But I think you know that already." As I continued the preparation process, I found myself talking to Mr. Chen about his life, based on information his family had shared. He'd been a beloved math teacher, a devoted husband, and a grandfather who never missed his grandchildren's school events. When I finished the embalming and stepped back to assess my work, Mr. Chen already had the smile. Not the gradual development I'd observed with others, but an immediate, clear expression of contentment that had appeared while I was speaking to him. I realized that the phenomenon wasn't about Room 7 itself. It was about connection. When I spoke to the deceased, acknowledged their lives and relationships, treated them as individuals rather than just bodies, to be prepared, they seemed to respond with that peaceful smile. The room had developed an atmosphere of respect and care over 8 decades of service. The families who commented on their loved ones' peaceful expressions weren't imagining things they were witnessing, the result of preparation done with genuine compassion and attention. I've changed my approach to working in Room 7. Instead of maintaining professional silence during the preparation process, I speak quietly to each person about their family, their accomplishments, their relationships. I treat them as honored guests, rather than just assignments to be completed. The smile appears more quickly now, often before I've finished the embalming process, and it remains consistent through the viewing period, providing comfort to families who see their loved ones looking genuinely at peace. Yesterday, while preparing Mrs. Sarah Thompson, her daughter stopped by to check on the arrangements. When she saw her mother's peaceful expression, she began crying not from grief, but from relief. "She looks so happy," she whispered. "She looks like herself again, before the illness took so much away from her." That's when I understood the real purpose of the phenomenon in Room 7. Some rooms hold on to the kindness that's been shown within their walls. Some spaces remember decades of gentle care and respectful treatment. And sometimes, that accumulated compassion finds a way to express itself in the peaceful smiles of those who are being prepared for their final journey home. Some deliveries arrive without any delivery truck. I'm Sally, and I've been maintaining the grounds at Hillcrest Memorial Park for 11 years. My work involves everything from mowing grass and trimming hedges to replacing wilted flowers and maintaining the overall beauty of the cemetery. It's satisfying work that helps families find peace in a place dedicated to memory and reflection. But over the past year, I've been dealing with flower deliveries that don't appear in any of our records and seem to follow rules that I'm still trying to understand. It started last spring when I noticed fresh white lilies appearing on certain graves throughout the cemetery. Nothing unusual about that. Families often leave flowers for their loved ones, and local florists make regular deliveries. But these particular lilies caught my attention because of their consistency and timing. The flowers appeared overnight, always white lilies, always arranged in simple glass vases, always placed on graves where the deceased had died on a Tuesday. I noticed the pattern while cross-referencing my maintenance logs with our burial records during a routine inventory. Mrs. Margaret Walsh died Tuesday, March 7th, 1989. Fresh lilies appeared on her grave every few weeks. Mr. David Thompson died Tuesday, August 15th, 2012. Same regular delivery of white lilies. Mrs. Eleanor Chen died Tuesday, September 22nd, 2019. Fresh lilies. Same schedule, same mysterious delivery method. I checked with our office staff to see if there was a standing order for these deliveries. Nothing in our records. I contacted the 3 local florists who regularly service the cemetery. None of them had any record of ongoing lily deliveries to those specific graves. The most puzzling aspect was what happened to the flowers. Normal floral arrangements left by families gradually wilt over the course of a week or so. These lilies stayed fresh for exactly 1 day, then turned black overnight and crumbled to ash by the following morning. Not wilted, blackened, as if they'd been touched by intense heat or some kind of chemical reaction. The ash was fine and gray, like the residue left after burning paper. By the time I arrived for my morning rounds, there would be nothing left but a small pile of ash around an empty glass vase. I started documenting the phenomenon, keeping track of which graves received the lilies, and photographing the flowers in their various stages. Fresh white lilies in the morning, healthy and vibrant throughout the day, black and crumbling by sunset, reduced to ash by dawn. The pattern was consistent across dozens of graves over several months. Only people who had died on Tuesdays. Only white lilies. Only this accelerated cycle of bloom and decay. I tried removing the lilies before they could blacken and turn to ash, thinking maybe I could preserve them or at least understand what was causing the rapid deterioration. But whenever I moved the vases or touched the flowers, they immediately began the blackening process, crumbling in my hands before I could take them to a different location. In August, I decided to position myself where I could observe one of the targeted graves overnight. Hoping to catch whoever was delivering the lilies, I chose Mrs. Catherine Murphy's grave. She died on Tuesday, June 4th, 1973, and had been receiving the mysterious lilies for months. I arrived at dusk and stationed myself behind a large oak tree where I could watch Mrs. Murphy's grave without being easily seen. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful, with just the usual sounds of evening birds settling into the trees, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. At exactly midnight, the lilies appeared, not delivered by a person, not placed by hands that I could see, but simply manifested on Mrs. Murphy's headstone. One moment the grave was bare. The next moment there was a glass vase filled with perfect white lilies, as if they had materialized from thin air. I remained hidden and continued watching. The lilies stayed bright and fresh throughout the night, glowing softly in the moonlight with an almost ethereal beauty. As dawn approached, I could see the transformation beginning. The white petals started to darken at the edges, slowly turning black, as if touched by invisible fire. By full sunrise, the lilies had completely blackened and were beginning to crumble. By the time I approached Mrs. Murphy's grave an hour later, there was nothing left but ash and an empty vase. I took samples of the ash to a local university laboratory, hoping chemical analysis might provide some clues about the unusual deterioration process. The results were inconclusive, The ash contained the expected carbon residue from burned organic matter, but there were no traces of accelerants, chemicals, or other substances that might explain the rapid decomposition. It's like they were consumed by an extremely high-temperature fire, the lab technician told me, but there's no indication of what might have caused such intense heat. I expanded my research to include the personal histories of the people whose graves were receiving the lilies. What I found was a heartbreaking pattern that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Every person who died on a Tuesday and received the mysterious lilies had died alone. Mrs. Margaret Walsh, found in her apartment 3 days after passing from a heart attack. Mr. David Thompson died in a car accident on an empty highway, discovered hours later by a passing motorist. Mrs. Eleanor Chen passed away in her sleep at a nursing home where she had no regular visitors. The Tuesday deaths were all people who had died without anyone present to hold their hand, say goodbye, or provide comfort in their final moments. The white lilies were appearing for those who had faced death in solitude. But the blackening and transformation to ash suggested something more complex than just memorial flowers. The rapid deterioration seemed to represent the consuming nature of loneliness, the way isolation can burn through a life and leave only emptiness behind. I started paying more attention to the timing of the lily appearances. They didn't occur randomly. They manifested on the anniversary of each person's death and on significant dates that would have been meaningful in their lives. Birthdays, wedding anniversaries, the dates their children were born. Last month, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of the entire phenomenon. While working near Mr. David Thompson's grave on what would have been his 60th birthday, I saw the lilies appear at noon rather than midnight. But this time, they weren't alone. A woman in her 30s approached the grave, carrying a small bouquet of mixed flowers. She knelt beside the headstone and began speaking quietly, apparently unaware of the white lilies that had just materialized beside her arrangement. "I'm sorry I wasn't there, Dad," she said softly. "I'm sorry you were alone when it happened. But I'm here now, and I want you to know that you're remembered and loved." As she spoke, the white lilies began to change. Instead of blackening and crumbling, they started to take on color: soft pink, gentle yellow, warm lavender. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, as if the woman's presence and words were reversing whatever process normally caused the flowers to deteriorate. When she finished her visit and walked away, the lilies remained colorful and vibrant. They stayed fresh for a full week before fading naturally, the way normal flowers should. I realized that the white lilies weren't just memorial flowers. They were calls for connection. They appeared for people who had died alone, serving as invitations for the living to visit, to speak, to acknowledge lives that had ended in isolation. When someone responded to that invitation, when a living person came to remember and honor the deceased, the lilies transformed from symbols of loneliness into expressions of love and connection. I've started keeping track of which graves receive visitors after the lilies appear. More often than not, family members or friends eventually come by, drawn by some instinct or memory, to visit at just the right time. When they do, the lilies change color and remain fresh for days instead of crumbling to ash. Last week, I left my own small tribute at Mrs. Margaret Walsh's grave, a handwritten note that read, "You are not forgotten. Your life had meaning and value." The white lilies that appeared that night transformed into the most beautiful shade of blue I've ever seen, and they lasted for 10 days. Some flowers bloom to celebrate life. Others appear to remind us that death should never be faced alone, and that even the departed deserve to know they're remembered with love and respect. My job has expanded beyond just maintaining the physical beauty of the cemetery. Now I also try to tend to the emotional landscape, making sure that the mysterious lilies find their way to transformation rather than ash, and that no one who rests in Hillcrest Memorial Park remains forgotten for too long. Some files contain information that hasn't happened yet. I'm Jim, and I've been the records keeper at Sunset Memorial Gardens for 14 years. My job involves maintaining burial records, updating family information, and ensuring that our documentation is accurate and accessible for future generations. It's meticulous work that requires attention to detail and respect for the permanent nature of the records we keep. But File Cabinet B has been challenging my understanding of time, mortality, and what it means to keep records for events that apparently haven't occurred yet. File Cabinet B is one of 6 filing systems in our records room, each containing different categories of cemetery documentation. Cabinet A holds active burial records for current interments. Cabinet C contains historical records from the cemetery's founding in 1937. Cabinet D houses maintenance and administrative files. File Cabinet B was supposed to contain pre-need contracts arrangements made by people who want to plan their own funerals in advance. These documents typically include burial preferences, service requirements, and payment information for people who are still living but want to ensure their final arrangements are properly handled. The first unusual file I discovered was labeled Robert Chen in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of creating it. Inside was a complete burial record showing that Robert had died on November 15, 2025, at age 73, from complications related to diabetes. The file included detailed funeral preferences, plot selection in Section F, and contact information for his adult children. Robert Chen was very much alive. In fact, he'd visited our office just 2 weeks earlier to inquire about pre-need arrangements for himself and his wife. He was healthy, active, and showed no signs of serious illness. Yet here was a detailed record of his death and burial, dated 8 months in the future. I assumed I'd made an error in filing, perhaps mixing up pre-need paperwork with completed burial records. But when I checked Robert's actual pre-need file in its proper location, I found it exactly where it should be, properly labeled, correctly dated, containing only the preliminary information he'd provided during his visit. The file in Cabinet B was different. It contained information that Robert hadn't provided, and details that suggested intimate knowledge of his future medical condition and family circumstances. Over the following weeks, I discovered more files in Cabinet B that followed the same disturbing pattern. Complete burial records for people who were still alive, detailed down to specific dates of death and precise funeral arrangements, all written in my handwriting, though I had no memory of creating any of them. Margaret Walsh, scheduled to die February 22nd, 2026, from a stroke in her sleep. Her file included a note about her preference for white roses and her request that her favorite hymn be played during the service. Margaret had never spoken to anyone at our cemetery about funeral arrangements. David Thompson predicted death date of April 10th, 2026, following a brief illness. His file specified burial in a military section due to his service in Vietnam, and included contact information for his estranged daughter, who would apparently reconcile with him before his death. Sarah Martinez's future death date of July 4th, 2026, from complications related to a surgical procedure. Her file contained detailed instructions for a graveside service and a request that her childhood teddy bear be buried with her. Each file was comprehensive and specific, containing the kind of personal details that only close family members would know. Yet none of these people had ever visited our cemetery or made any arrangements with us. I started cross-referencing the predicted death dates with local hospital records and physician reports, thinking maybe there was some medical basis for the specific timing. But the people mentioned in Cabinet B's files were all in good health, according to their most recent medical checkups. No terminal diagnoses, no high-risk conditions, no indication that death was imminent. The most unsettling discovery came when I found my own file in Cabinet B. James Robert Morrison, my full name, though most people know me simply as Jim. Death date listed as September 12th, 2027. Cause of death, noted as sudden cardiac arrest while working late in the records room. The file included burial preferences I'd never discussed with anyone. Cremation with ashes scattered in the cemetery's rose garden. No formal service, just a small gathering of colleagues and friends. Reading my own death record was surreal and terrifying. The handwriting was definitely mine, neat and precise in the style I'd developed over 14 years of record keeping. But I had absolutely no memory of writing it. I consulted with my supervisor, Director Patterson, about the mysterious files. She was understandably skeptical about burial records for living people, especially ones that included specific future death dates. "Jim, are you feeling all right?" she asked, examining several of the files. "This is definitely your handwriting, but these records make no sense. Are you sure you didn't create them during some kind of planning exercise or training scenario?" I was certain I hadn't. The files were too detailed, too personal, too specific to be the result of practice exercises or hypothetical planning. Director Patterson suggested that I might be experiencing some kind of stress-related memory issues, possibly creating the files during periods of fatigue or distraction, and then forgetting about them. She recommended that I take some time off and consider speaking with a counselor about work-related stress. But I knew I wasn't losing my memory or experiencing psychological problems. The files in Cabinet B were real, detailed, and accurate in every way, except for the impossible fact that they documented deaths that hadn't happened yet. I decided to test the accuracy of the predictions by monitoring one of the people mentioned in the files. I chose Margaret Walsh because her predicted death date was only 3 months away, and I could observe whether the circumstances matched what was documented in her file. Margaret was an 86-year-old retired teacher who lived independently in a senior community about 10 miles from the cemetery. According to her file, she would die peacefully in her sleep from a stroke on February 22nd, and her niece would arrange a simple funeral service featuring white roses and the hymn, "Amazing Grace." I didn't contact Margaret directly. That would have been inappropriate and potentially harmful, but I discreetly monitored the local obituary notices, waiting to see if the prediction would prove accurate. On February 23rd, Margaret Walsh's obituary appeared in the local newspaper. She had died peacefully in her sleep on February 22nd from complications related to a stroke. Her funeral service would be held at our cemetery, featuring white roses and her favorite hymn, "Amazing Grace." The arrangements were being made by her niece, exactly as documented in the file. Every detail was correct. I checked Margaret's file again and found that it had been updated with additional information: the exact time of death, the name of the physician who signed the death certificate, and the specific plot number where she would be buried, all in my handwriting, though I had no memory of adding these details. Over the following months, I watched with growing unease as other predictions from Cabinet B proved equally accurate. Robert Chen was diagnosed with diabetes complications in October and died on November 15th, exactly as his file had specified. David Thompson reconnected with his estranged daughter in March and passed away on April 10th following a brief illness. Each death occurred precisely as documented, and each file was mysteriously updated with final details in my own handwriting. I stopped opening Cabinet B regularly, disturbed by the accurate predictions and my apparent inability to remember creating the files. But last week, I discovered that new files had appeared, burial records for people I recognized from around town, all with future death dates in 2028 and 2029. Among the new files was one that made my hands shake: Patricia Morrison, my wife's name. Her predicted death date was listed as March 18th, 2028, with a note about her preference for a simple memorial service and burial beside my future grave in the Rose Garden section. I haven't told Patricia about the file. How do you explain to someone you love that you've apparently documented their death 18 months before it's supposed to happen? How do you cope with information that suggests you can predict the future but can't control it? Yesterday, I made a decision that felt both necessary and futile. I removed all the files from Cabinet B and locked them in a secure storage area where I won't be tempted to review them regularly. If I truly am somehow recording future deaths, then knowing the details only causes anguish without providing any ability to change the outcomes. But this morning, when I opened Cabinet B to verify it was empty, I found a single new file with my name on it. Inside was an updated death record showing that my own passing had been moved up by 6 months now, scheduled for March 15th, 2027. At the bottom of the file, in my own careful handwriting, was a note I didn't remember writing. Some knowledge is a burden too heavy for the living to carry, but someone must keep the records, even when they document sorrows that haven't arrived yet. File Cabinet B continues to fill itself with information I don't want to possess and can't seem to stop creating. Some jobs extend beyond what we expect them to require, and some responsibilities follow us into territory we never intended to explore. All I can do is maintain the records as accurately as possible and hope that whoever takes over my position when March 15th, 2027 arrives will understand that Cabinet B serves a purpose I've never been able to fully comprehend, but apparently can't avoid fulfilling.